The second of the two gerrymandering cases that you're responsible to know is the more recent one. This is the 1993 case of Shaw v. Reno. And just like Baker v. Carr, again, the main topic is something dealing with like the process of gerrymandering. Shaw is a white North Carolina resident who sues the United States government. In this case, it's the Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, that is named in the lawsuit. And you'll see why in a second. So she is the Attorney General of the United States. She is the Director of the Department of Justice. She is sued by a white North Carolina resident. So here's the background to the case. This one's a little bit more elaborate, as you'll notice in your on the guided notes packet template that you've been given. So North Carolina had a history of not having a very diverse set of representatives being elected out of it. In 1990, there were exactly zero minority representatives from North Carolina's reps, despite the fact that African Americans made up a decent part of North Carolina's population, almost 20%. But despite that, African Americans and other minority groups were not elected to the United States House of Representatives. It just so also happened that in 1990, because of the census that was conducted in 1990, North Carolina was awarded an additional representative, so they were getting a new congressional district. Prior to this, they had 11 districts. The reapportionment process happened after the 1990 census, gave North Carolina a 12th district. So they would have to go through the redistricting process. Here's some additional background information that's relevant to this case. In 1965, one of the most significant pieces of legislation was passed in this country. It was the Voting Rights Act. This did a variety of things, but one of the things that it did was it attempted to identify states, Southern and otherwise, that had a history of discriminating against African Americans voting wise, right? So they basically went through and they compared the number of African Americans that historically voted in those states with the overall sort of like part of the population that they made up. And basically, any of the states that are in green on this map were basically deemed to have had way more African Americans in their state than actual voters. So it was determined by the government that they must be doing something that was discriminatory in preventing African Americans from voting. So, what the 1965 Voting Rights Act required was that from this point forward, all, even into the modern times, right, that all of the states pictured in the green, if they made any changes to anything regarding voting or the voting process in their state, that they would have to get what is called pre-clearance or like permission. You would have to run the change by the Department of Justice first, so the Department of Justice could determine if you were doing this for legitimate reasons, the change, or if you were back to your old ways of discriminating against African American voters. The Department of Justice required in this particular case, right? North Carolina redistricts and they add in a 12th district, and they have to submit this to the Department of Justice because of like the whole pre-clearance process, because this is a change to voting in North Carolina, is the redrawing of the districts. Because they were basically put on this naughty list back in 1965, they're gonna have to run this through the Department of Justice first. When the Department of Justice like reviews their redistricting plan, they decide that they're not happy with it, and they force North Carolina to draw what's called a majority minority district. This 12th district, this new district, they are requiring it to be a majority minority district. They're telling North Carolina this is what they want. A majority minority district is a district that is intentionally drawn to make African Americans the majority within that district, increasing the odds that perhaps they would be able to elect a minority representative from that particular district. Right? So this is like the background information related to the case. Okay, so if you notice, the purple kind of thin district that is in the middle-ish part of the state, that is the district that is the majority minority district that North Carolina drew into their district map to comply with the wishes of the Department of Justice through the pre-clearance process. Once this is implemented, 5 white voters sue, saying these new districts were racially discriminatory against them as white people, that race should not be a consideration in any way, shape, or form in the drawing of these districts. What makes this case so interesting is that it had already been determined by the Supreme Court that Southern legislatures could not draw the districts in a way to hurt the voting power of minority groups. But the Supreme Court had never decided, could you use race as a consideration if you're drawing the districts in a way to benefit the voting power of minority groups? So these white voters are angry because they feel like race is being used as a factor. It may help African Americans, but it may hurt them. So, the constitutional connection to this case is again the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, because these 5 white voters are alleging discrimination. And as we've mentioned before, the 14th Amendment is always the go to as a basis for all types of discrimination lawsuits. So they are alleging, these white voters, that they are being excluded because of their race, and that is discriminatory, and that violates the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So the question that it has to be answered by the court is, was the majority minority district drawn by North Carolina at the request of the Department of Justice a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause? And this is also now why Reno is named in this lawsuit, because she was the director, the attorney general, the director of the Department of Justice, who ordered the drawing of this majority minority district. The Supreme Court decided 5-4 that yes, this district that made African Americans intentionally the majority was discriminatory. That the Supreme Court was very uncomfortable with the only sort of like motivation of this district being including people based on like their race. That this district went like very far across the state, and that the only thing that these people had in common was essentially like the color of their skin, and that made the Supreme Court feel like very uncomfortable. So the overall sort of impact of this case is that once and for all, this establishes that race cannot be used as the sole factor in the drawing of congressional districts. A previous case had said that race could not be considered, like if a white legislature was intentionally making African Americans the minority, that would not be permissible. But this case also said that race could not be a factor, even if the intention was to make the African Americans the majority, so that potentially more minority representatives would be elected from the state.